So would it be okay if we introduce ourselves? I'm an assistant professor, associate professor here at SELS.
And I'm Rob Capra. I'm a full professor here, and I work in the areas of human-computer interaction and information retrieval.
So let me get it started with my first question, Rob. You've been doing some really interesting work on large language models and the implications of systems like ChatGPT, particularly in the context of information search. And of course, this is an ongoing research. This is just the beginning of this really interesting, I wouldn't call it revolution, but important transformation. How do you see the impact of these systems in our information search behavior and information evaluation?
That's a great question. You hit a big question to start with. So as many of us know, large language models, generative AI, ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion, all these systems that have really sort of hit the market in the last year have been transforming the way people interact with information, the way they search for information, the way search interfaces are presenting themselves and work. And so what we've been trying to do in our research in our lab is to look at that impact, right? So for 30 years, 25, 30 years, we've all been searching with tools like Google that give us a ranked list of answers. We type in a query and it gives us a ranked list of answers. But the model to use with these generative AI systems and large language models is very different. I can type in a large amount of text, or I can take a whole assignment that a professor has given me and type that into or copy that into ChatGPT and use that as my prompt instead of my query. It's now my prompt. And that changes the way that people are interacting with these systems. And so what we've been doing in our lab is doing some studies to try to understand how does it change the way people go about searching, and how does it change how they go about evaluating the information, and do they trust these systems, and all these questions that now we have to grapple with these new systems. So
that's very interesting.
And I'm happy to talk more about it at some point here, but sure. I don't want to monopolize the discussion either.
That's fine. So let me ask you one quick question follow-up before we move on. What has been the primary difference of these systems compared to the more traditional search engines that have dominated?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I'll give you a little nugget. So we did a study earlier this year, and this was a small scale study. It only involved 10 people, and they were all students at UNC. So they were pretty adept searchers to begin with. And what we had them do is we had them do a set of tasks where they needed to research information on a topic. And we had them do it using a kind of a combined interface that had a search interface on one side, regular web search, and it also had a ChatGPT interface side by side. And we did this study before, like, the Bing and Google interfaces were publicly available. They were just in limited release at that time. And so we had people do these search tasks, and we kind of looked at what they did. We had them think aloud during the task, and then we asked them some interview questions at the end about the whole experience and what they thought. And one of the big differences that I saw was that they engaged with these systems in some different ways. So, for example, one thing that commonly happens when you're looking for information, searching for information about a topic that you're unfamiliar with is you don't know where to get started. And you don't know what the important sort of lay of the land is. And so there were some people that used these tools to kind of get the lay of the land. They would type their query or their prompt into the chat, and the chat would come back and say, oh, here's what this topic is generally about. Here's some things you can look at to get started. And they would use those as starting points, but then they would take those starting points and go search in the search engine on their own. And we thought that was a really interesting use of the technology because they were using it in a way almost like they would rely on an expert or somebody that they could talk to get started. Another way they were using it is maybe they were doing some searching on their own using the web search, and they would stumble or get down to some information on a page that they didn't understand. You know, maybe they were reading an article and it got too technical or something. So instead of then pausing there and doing another web search to try to answer the sub question that came up, they would keep that page open, but then they would go over to the chat and they would ask the chat, the AI chat, you know, tell me more about this topic that I'm confused by, that I'm reading about. And so they would use it as a way to answer the little questions that were coming up as they were reading a primary document, and a way to save them having to do like a whole nother sub search in their search process. And so we thought that was pretty interesting too.
That's fascinating how these emergent behaviors we're witnessing today.
Yeah, yeah. So can I turn the tables and ask you a question or two? Because I know you've been doing some work in this general area of large language models and generative AI also. And so you've been looking at, as I understand it, how these technologies are going to fit into the workplace and the work context. And you had a really nice article published recently, Artificial Intelligence in the Work Context. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. And one of the things that you said in this article was that the use of AI should be understood in relation to the key dimensions of the work context. So what do you mean by that? And what do we need to be thinking about in terms of work context and AI?
So that's a very good question. When it comes to a discussion around AI, of course, a lot of it is overhyped, understandably. Generative AI, no exception here. In terms of the research landscape and what we see in the media outlets, social media, we've got these two really dominant narratives. We've got these very large scale studies, macro level, that looks at jobs that will be removed, will be exposed to AI automation. So they're helpful. I'm not questioning, you know, the validity of this research. And also we've got these very micro experimental research studies that are very focused on comparison of tasks among humans. In most cases, that's a very common, you know, approach, and AI as a counterpart. And then often the findings is, you know, AI is doing really well when it comes to taking classic exams of, you know, all different types of certification, USMLE, you know, bar exams and all types of things. So often these two narratives together results in a very big push that, you know, we are being replaced, you know, in a wholesale manner. A lot of knowledge workers, information professionals will be removed. My research is a little bit different. It's probably in the middle. Going back to what you read, you really need to understand, you need to go outside of the lab in daily work practices to understand how technology fits. And this is not anything new about AI. We've been seeing a lot of these hypes around other technologies. So basically what I'm trying to do is contextualizing the use of affordance and challenges and, you know, limitations. There are a lot of limitations with these systems. One thing that we are both completely aware of it is this problem of hallucination when it comes to generative AI systems.
Yeah.
That is quite problematic in particularly high-stake decision-making, in medical settings, in areas where compliance frameworks are very dominant, like in legal context. So we really need to understand how these technologies matter. There is no question about them. They bring up a really important transformation in how information practices are being done. But we need to understand how they fit in the bigger socio-technical dynamics of work. You mentioned that they're not going to replace already existing search engine. People are using them in tandem in very interesting synergetic manners. So understanding the current technological framework, the current work practices, and really delving deeper in daily practices of workers. And this will really help complement those two lab-based and macro-level perspectives about AI systems and their implications.
Do you feel like we know right now how, like from a student perspective, I think a lot of students are wondering, what do I need to know about these technologies to go and be competitive in the future workplace? Do we know what that looks like, or?
The good answer is no, but a framework that we recently developed is the future will be characterized by two types of skills, competitive and collaborative or cooperative skills. And what I mean is we need to work on areas that we are good at, we as humans. That's what I call competitive skills. There are things that we should give up. They're not gonna, these guys, these technologies are very good at. When it comes to analytical skills, data-centric skills, they are gonna dominate. And they're already making that mark in the job market, in the job, in a lot of variety of positions, a lot of different occupations. So we need to focus on our competitive advantage as humans. And we provided that in the Harvard Business Review article. Those are our emotional, social intelligence, holistic, strategic thinking, understanding of the context. Humans are very good at putting things into context. Machines often lack that broader understanding of things and stakeholders when it comes to organizational context. And collaborative skills, things that in the future these machines are going to be our partners. So their role in mediating work is elevated. They're not just support infrastructure like much of the past technologies. Understanding how we can collaborate with them as counterparts, that's what I call collaborative skills. One of the major ones that we try really hard to teach at SILS is critical understanding of the implications of these technologies. Is it ethical to use this technology in this specific context? Machines lack that type of acumen.
Yeah. No, that's really, really interesting. Can I also ask you about, you had a recent article in the Communications of the ACM, which is one of the flagship publications in the area of computing and computer science and information science. And one of the things you talked about in that article was sort of the human-centeredness of data work. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and what does that mean in the context of all of this new AI?
So in that article, we make a case that for years AI systems have been very model-centric, and particularly the technical community. The primary goal has been to optimize the model and performance of the model. And what does that mean? It's taking attention away from the data that feeds these systems. So there's this general, and this comes actually from the technical community, data-centric approach to AI. And in this article, we make the case that data is a very socio-technical phenomena. It's human-centered. It means that our students are quite good in understanding that data. These systems are not objective because the data that feeds them are not objective. It's the reflection of our social biases. So in this article, we try really hard to bring out the human dimension of data. And some of the things that we as information scientists, we've been paying attention for decades. When it comes, let's go back to the example of generative AI system. One of the biggest problems with these systems is data provenance.
Right.
We as users, we want to know when the system makes this assertion, where does that come from? In our social conversation, if someone is making a claim about a health issue, the second question or first question is, where did you hear this?
Exactly. Exactly.
And that these systems are not really good at that.
So that's really interesting, because that's one of the things that stood out in the study that we did earlier this spring. Was we asked people things that they liked and didn't like about using the generative AI system as part of their search, and hands down the most common thing they mentioned not liking with not having sources, right? That the generative AI would produce this output and it wouldn't tell them where the sources were, and they couldn't verify those sources. And so they were kind of looking at this information, almost like you said, it was like somebody told this to them, but wouldn't tell them where it came from.
So can I ask you a question, given that that's such a big handicap of these systems? Do you think this data provenance and lack of references, lack of citation is an inherent limitations of large language models and cannot be, if you actually fix it, you might take away the power of these systems?
So I'll kind of answer that question in a not quite direct way. So large language models are built to do what they do, and they're very good at it. But one of my colleagues that I was talking to at a conference recently put it this way: it's a very weird thing to interact directly with a large language model, which is what we're kind of doing now. Although there are a lot more safeguards in place than there were back in maybe February of this year. But to interact directly with the large language model is kind of a weird thing in a way. Instead, I think we're going to find that these large language models are incorporated as part of systems that have additional components, right? Additional components that do verification, fact checking, attribution, provenance and source provision. And so the fact that these models don't have that built into them right now, they weren't designed to do that. But I think we're going to find that we're building systems that do include those components because we want them. We want the ability to be able to say, okay, this system generated some text or some claim, and we need to know where is that claim coming from, or what's it associated with, or how can we attribute it.
And is this what Microsoft Bing is doing to some extent, doing the live search at the same time as people using the large language model in the...
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in that space. And there are some systems that try to provide some outlinks in the context of the output from the generative AI. Some of those are better than others. There have been some studies that have found that some of those links that are provided aren't actually links that support the things that they're looking like they support. So I think there's definitely going to be progress to be made in those areas. And I also think it's going to be a ongoing kind of iteration and experimentation on how people want to integrate sort of the web search side of that and the generative AI side of that, right? Because they each have their own strengths, and how you leverage the strengths of each may become a distinguisher in search engines, or maybe there's going to be some new search engine that we don't know about yet that it's going to integrate these things in some way that works really well, right? And so I think there's a really it's kind of an exciting time to be in that space doing research, because it's opening up new possibilities. But it's also, as you pointed out, a time that we need to be very, very careful that we're doing this in a responsible way and in an ethical way, and that companies are not just providing tools that are going to mislead people or confuse them.
So everything I hear is based on this conversation. Large language model might not be good standalone systems. They need to be supplemented by systems that complement the weaknesses of these systems.
That's where I think things are probably going to go. Yeah. I wanted to maybe shift a little, because you and I both have an interest in education, and I know that we wanted to talk a little bit about education and AI. Can you start us off in that space and tell us a little bit about your thoughts about students and generative AI?
So I think we've been grappling with the use of information technology in education for years. Gary used to bring up the example of Socrates and writing. I'm not that old, but I can tell I remember the days of internet. I'm old enough to remember that the internet created a lot of concerns among educators, about cheating problems, citations, references, and all of these things that are kind of important in this next generation of AI system in the current generation. So I don't think yes, qualitatively this system is different. That's right. Yes. So what I think is this is gonna stay. This is not gonna go away. So block and wait or block and avoid approaches are not gonna work. That's very simple. Never worked with internet. Never worked with calculator. Never worked with other types of what I call cognitive technologies that are very important in education, because education is about cognition and perception. My approach is finding ways, you use the term guardrails. That's a very, very interesting way to put it. And creating a safe space around these technologies. But students are going to use them in their future career. My research, your research makes it clear that people are using it. A recent survey by, I think, Reuters came out, and it shows a vast number of people are using them, people being in the workplace. And many of them are not really sure about policies. The state of policy in education and corporate is behind the actual use of these technologies. And I'm not, to wrap it up, to just put it simply, I'm not too concerned. We're going to come to the term, we're smart people as, academic community. Outside of academia, we can figure it out. It's just this transition time that makes people a little bit nervous. But this is going to be part of everything you say. This is part of our information arsenal. This is not going to go away. So we need to figure out how to take advantage of it and avoid challenges and problems of these systems.
So I know there are some people in education that are very worried about these technologies and are worried that this is the end of critical thought and things like that. It sounds like you don't fall into that camp. It sounds like you fall into the category of people that we need to learn how to use these tools.
No, they are quite helpful tools for, and honestly, I mean, the way I use it to automate some of our mundane tasks that are not sources of learning. In my research in the use of AI, I've been really emphasizing and pushing this concept of mutual learning between us and them. They learn from us. It's very clear. We have to learn from these systems. One of the major learning is what is it that these systems are good at, and what is it that they need supervision and constant monitoring and vigilance on the user side on us. And also just learning, I can learn about English structure or ways to put things more professionally. They're learning involved in these systems, I'm sure, and eventually they're not going to go away. We can just ignore them or block them. What about you? What is your thoughts, since you have been also involved in this campus level initiative?
Yeah. So I was involved in a campus-wide effort this summer with people from different departments and different schools to put together a set of recommendations or guidance. We didn't want to necessarily call them guidelines because they're not being imposed on anybody, but guidance to help students understand the use of these technologies in their classes. And I'll preface all of this by saying that one of the things that was almost universally agreed was that individual faculty members need to be able to control or have changes and adaptations to this in their individual classes, because they know the pedagogy that they're working with. And so these were sort of general guidance points, but obviously would need to be adapted and things. But I think the overriding one that just sort of made the most sense to me was that AI can help you think, but it shouldn't think for you, right? And if we can think of it through that lens of how can this be a tool to help me learn? How can this be a tool to help me understand these concepts better? I've heard about students that are using generative AI to generate example questions to quiz themselves on. I think that's a great idea. Those are kind of cases where I'm going to try to leverage this technology to help me learn the material. But if I'm relying on it to do the thinking for me or to do the work for me, that's crossing over into a different territory that you don't want to be in. I think one of the other things that really was important that came out of that group was that ultimately we all are responsible for the products that we deliver. So if we use any of these AI technologies in developing a paper or whatever it might be, an assignment, that we're turning it in and we're responsible for it. You know, as a faculty member, if I use it in my research and write a paper, I submit that paper and I'm responsible for what I've said in that paper. And so we know that these tools hallucinate and make things up. And so now the burden becomes I have to also verify all the things that the AI has just told me. And so in some ways, if somebody's just wanting to rely on this, they could get into some bad situations because if you don't evaluate what it's telling you or verify what it's telling you, it might have hallucinated what it told, you know, what it was produced. So I think there's a lot of good ways to use AI tools in education. And I think students are already doing that. I think they're finding some really good ways. And like you said, throughout history, there have been ways for people to cheat and skirt the assignments. And yes, this is another one that could be used that way. But I also think there's some really powerful ways that it can help students.
Absolutely. Just one thing I want to say is Gary wrote, my old pal Socrates died for random access, not for generative prediction. It was the asking questions, not the providing streams of language tokens. Quite cryptic. He has to explain it later. But one thing I want to emphasize, building up your last thoughts, is in the work setting, the actual conclusion is the AI is not gonna, these systems are not gonna replace expert and expertise, human expertise, but definitely our roles will shift. The same happens in education. The way that, I mean, we as professors interact with students, the way that the students absorb information, that changed after the internet. Some of the things that we emphasize pre-internet era, they're not really useful because those competencies were removed by information access, like global information access to some extent. So I think overall, we need to really figure out our niche, our sweet spot as humans, as educators, as students, and just leave the things that can be automated by AI systems. In my work, I try to articulate those and figure out where we provide value. And with every single important, what we can call disruptive technology, information technology, we really need to rethink our role as humans. This is no different. Of course, it's more intrusive. The large language model, generative AI, are more intrusive in terms of, you know, the realm of perception and cognition, which are the basis of knowledge work. In the previous ways of automation, it was more geared towards blue collar, you know, physical labor like robots. But again, that didn't mean that all manual workers were replaced. Their role really shifted. And the same will happen in, you know, understanding what is it that we can do to provide value and in education. Are we at time, Susan? We've got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'll just put one last thought in. And this was an interesting thing that came out of the study we did this spring also, was that we found some cases where you know, people were pretty critical of the information that was being generated by these generative AI tools, and they would look at it with a critical eye. But we did find some cases where people were lulled by it, if you will. You know, it was like, oh, this is the topic where I kind of know something about it, and 2 of the 3 things that it's telling me jive with what I know, and so maybe I'm going to assume that the 3rd thing is also true. Right. And so that's a point that we all have to be careful of, I think, with these technologies, is not to another case that we saw was under time pressure, people might rely on them more. Right. And so I think there is that human tendency to sort of say, oh, well, I recognize those 2 things. Maybe the 3rd thing's right. And I think we got to be careful with that with these technologies.
Fantastic note to end this conversation.
Well, thanks, Mohammad. This has been really awesome.
Thank you, Rob, for asking really interesting questions and providing your thoughts on these very important topics.